For 31 years, investigators would say they knew almost everything about Joni Grigsby except the one thing that mattered. They knew how she died. They could not say why, or by whose hand, or where that hand had come from. Joni Marie Grigsby was 33 years old. She was born in Long Beach, California, and as a girl attended a private school in Noti, Oregon, the kind of small place that barely registers on a state map. She made the Lane County area her home for roughly 22 years. She was the mother of 2 sons, Jonathan Shores and David Shores, both of Roseburg. She had worked as a homemaker and as a waitress, the ordinary labor of an ordinary life, lived close to the people who knew her. Her younger brother, John Roberts, would later describe her as a fun-loving, happy-go-lucky person with a beautiful spirit. That is the version of Joni that survives in the record. Not a case file. A sister, a mother, a woman who waited tables and raised 2 boys. The night that ended it was June 6, 1995. Around 9 o'clock that evening, a passerby moving along the edge of the Willamette River came upon her body in tall grass on the Glenwood side of the Main Street Bridge. The bridge was a steel truss span built in 1929, a long gray skeleton of girders carrying traffic between Springfield and Glenwood in Lane County, Oregon. Beneath it, the grass grew high and the river kept moving, indifferent. The passerby had not been looking for anything. People rarely are. According to the Lane County Sheriff's Office, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. That is the manner of her death, stated once, because she was more than the manner of her death, and the rest of this is about everything those words could not explain. What investigators could establish, they established quickly. Detectives determined that Joni had been killed close to where she was found, not transported there from somewhere else. The Glenwood riverbank was not a dumping ground. It was the place itself, the last place. That detail would matter for decades because it narrowed the geography of the crime to a few yards of grass under an old bridge and still answered nothing about the human being who had stood in that grass with her. And here the contradiction sets in, the one that would shape everything that followed. The people closest to Joni are the first place any investigation looks. A husband, a partner, a friend, a name that surfaces in an address book. That is how most of these cases resolve. They resolve inward, toward someone the victim already knew. Joni's case would not. Year after year, every familiar face would be examined and set aside. The person responsible for her death, it would eventually emerge, was not in her life at all. He was a stranger. No history with her, no overlap, no reason that anyone who loved her could point to and say, "There, that is where it came from." So the question that opens this case is not who in Joni's world did this. It is the harder one, the one that took 31 years to reach. If it was no one she knew, then where did he come from? Springfield, Oregon. Late spring 1995. The Main Street Bridge crosses the Willamette, where the town presses up against Glenwood, a working-class stretch of river bound by mill yards and rail lines and the low hum of traffic over old steel. The bridge itself had stood since 1929, a riveted truss spanning the water, the kind of fixture a place stops noticing. On the evening of June 2nd, it became something else. She was found in the grass near the Glenwood approach, not by a detective working a lead, not by a neighbor who knew her name, by a passerby, someone moving through an ordinary evening who looked where they should not have had to look and saw Joni Grigsby where she had been left. Lane County Sheriff's detectives came to the riverbank. They walked the grass, the approach, the shadow of the truss. By the time they were done, the word was settled: homicide. There was no question of what had happened to her. The manner of her death was not in doubt. What followed was the quiet, deliberate work of people who knew they might only get one chance. They preserved the medical evidence. They collected DNA from the scene, the one thread that in 1995 the case offered up. And they made a choice that would define the years ahead. They held the autopsy details back. They did not give the public the specifics. As one of the detectives would later put it, "We try to protect those facts or evidence on the front end." So look at what they actually had, standing on that riverbank as the light went. They had a body. They had a method. They had genetic material, a profile belonging to whoever had done this. It was, in one sense, everything. The killer had left himself behind in the only language that could not lie. And in another sense, it was nothing they could use, because a DNA profile in 1995 was only as good as the name you could set beside it. They had no name. They had no motive, nothing to explain why Joni, why that night, why the Glenwood side of an old bridge. They had no thread to pull, no falling out, no jealous ex, no grievance that pointed anywhere. The usual map a detective draws. Who knew her, who wanted her gone, who was the last to see her. That map had nothing on it. What they could not have known, standing there, was the shape of the answer. That the man whose blood they had collected was not in Joni's life at all. Not a face from her circle, not a name in Lane County. A stranger with no connection to her, to the town, to anyone she had ever known. They knew how she had died. They did not know who, and the bridge that had watched it happen now stood over the beginning of a very long wait. Subscribe before the next part, because what the detectives did next should have cracked this case wide open, and the reason it didn't is the part you won't be able to shake. Joni's case sat in that strange, cruel category. Investigators knew almost everything. They could read the crime scene. They had a genetic profile of the man responsible, recovered and preserved. What they did not have was a name to put against it. In the months after, the Lane County Sheriff's Office did not sit on what they had. The detectives moved hard, and they moved wide. They built a list of men who lived near the bridge, men with records that fit, men who had no clear account of where they had been. One by one, the detectives brought them in. One by one, they took a sample for comparison against the profile left at the scene. By the time they were done, 40 men had been swabbed and tested. 40. For a mid-size Oregon county in 1995, that is not a small number. That is a department emptying its drawers, knocking on every door that might lead somewhere, leaving as little as possible to chance. And then the results came back. Every one of the 40 was cleared. Not one of them matched. Look at the shape of that, because it is the heart of why this case went the way it did. The system did not fail here. The net was real, and it was wide, and it was cast by people who wanted an answer as badly as anyone. They did the work. They did it right. And it came up empty. It came up empty for a reason that had nothing to do with anyone slipping through. The 40 were cleared because the 40 were innocent. The man the detectives were looking for had never been in the net at all. He was not a neighbor. He was not a name on anyone's list. He had no quarrel with Joni, no history with the area, no thread tying him to that bridge or that town. He was a stranger in the truest, coldest sense of the word. And in 1995, a stranger was almost the perfect kind of killer to be. Think about what comparison actually requires. To match a profile, you need someone to compare it against. You need a suspect, a name, a person already inside the circle. The detectives had a profile that could identify one man on Earth with near certainty, but it could only ever speak when it was held up beside someone they had already found. It could confirm. It could not point. If the man's genetic profile sat in no database, if no prior arrest had ever filed it away, then there was nothing in the world for that crime scene evidence to be matched against. It could wait. That was all it could do. So the case did not go cold because a detective got lazy, or a file got lost, or a lead got ignored. It went cold against a wall that no amount of effort in 1995 could climb. The science of the time could prove who someone was. It simply had no way to tell you who they were when they were a stranger to everyone. The tools to follow that profile out into the wider world, past the circle of the known, did not exist yet. The 40 had been ruled out. The 41st had no name. And so the file was set down, not closed, just waiting, while the years began to stack on top of it. 1 year, then 5, then 10. The evidence held steady in storage, unchanged, patient, keeping its single secret intact, waiting for a world that could finally ask it a different question. The case stayed cold for 31 years. Say that number out loud and it loses its shape. 31 years is a child born, raised, and sent into the world. It is a career start to finish. It is most of a marriage. For Joni's family, it was the length of a question with no answer at the end of it. Her younger brother, John Roberts, carried it the whole way. 3 decades of waking up to the same blank wall. According to KVAL, he is now 19 years sober and spends his time helping other people find their way out. That detail matters. Grief does not announce itself the way people expect. Sometimes it goes underground and comes back as a slow, private war you fight for years before you steady. Roberts steadied. He turned the steadying into work for others. That is the shape some grief takes in the people who survive it. His questions, reported by NBC 16, never settled on who or why. They settled on where. Where did this man come from? Because by then the family already understood something the rest of us arrive at slowly. The roughly 40 men investigators had looked at and cleared had told them, by elimination, what kind of man this was not. He was not a neighbor, not a friend who turned, not anyone seated at their table. He came from outside the small, knowable world Joni lived in and walked back into it when he was done. The answer, whatever it was somewhere else, somewhere they could not see and could not reach. There were 2 boys. Jonathan and David Shores grew up without their mother. Lookout Eugene Springfield reported the simple fact of it, and the fact is enough. They did not lose her to time or distance. They lost her to a stranger, and then lost the explanation too. They grew up inside the gap. Birthdays she was not at. Ordinary days she was not at. A name they could not give the thing that took her. And here, quietly, is a detail to hold on to. One of those sons, John Shores, would say later that no investigator ever called him directly about what eventually happened in this case. He would learn it the way strangers learn things, the way the public learns things. Set that down gently for now. It comes back. Through all of it, the family understood the system was trying. The 40 men cleared were not nothing. Each one was someone's hours, someone's paperwork, someone's knock on a door. People did the work. People kept the file. And still, year after year, the answer did not come. That is the particular weight of a long, cold case. It is not always neglect. Sometimes it is effort that simply runs out of road. Everyone doing what they can, and the thing still not moving. 31 years, a brother who climbed out of his own dark and turned to pull others up. 2 sons who became men in the space where their mother should have been. A question worn so smooth by repetition, it had stopped sounding like a question and started sounding like a fact of life. Where did he come from? For most of those years, nothing answered. The file stayed shut. The world moved. The family waited inside a silence that had learned to feel permanent. It would not stay permanent. If you're still with Joni's story, subscribe, because the people who finally moved this case were not the ones you would expect, and they were working with almost nothing. By the 2000s, the system had done what it could. The detectives who first worked Joni's case were retiring or already gone. The files stayed where unsolved files stay, in a box, on a shelf, in the quiet that settles over a case nobody can move. For a long time, nothing happened. Then something did, and it did not come from the people you would expect. In Lane County, the work of looking again fell to 6 men. Not active detectives, not a funded task force. 6 retired law enforcement officers, volunteers, working on donations. The Lane County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit had no budget for a lab, no badges that meant anything anymore, no paycheck riding on whether they cleared a thing. They had careers behind them. They could have been done. They chose not to be. That is the part worth holding. These were men who had spent their working lives inside the system, who had every reason to rest, and who decided that cases like Joni's do not close themselves. Someone has to choose to reopen them. The unit is led by retired Detective Sergeant Chad Rogers. Among the volunteers is retired Detective Kurt West. The work they did was reported by the Lane County Sheriff's Office and by outlets including KVAL, NBC 16, and KCBY. And there is a quiet irony in it worth naming. The system that could not finish Joni's case was now leaning on men it no longer technically employed. The badge had moved on, the men had not. What they had in 2023 that nobody had in 1995 was a tool, forensic genetic genealogy. It did not exist when Joni died. It existed now. And the one thing the case had always held on to, the crime scene DNA, preserved, kept cold, kept careful for nearly 3 decades, was still good, still viable. After all those years, the most important thing in the file had not degraded into nothing. It had waited. So the unit made a decision. They took that preserved DNA and submitted it to an outside private laboratory. The investigators never released the lab's name. What they released was the choice itself, the decision to revisit a case the system had set down, to pull the evidence back out, to send it somewhere it had never been, and to wait. Understand what that decision costs. For 28 years, the file had answered one question and refused the other. It could tell you how Joni died. It could not tell you who. Every road in had been walked, 40 people cleared, a family left to carry the weight with no name to set it against. To reopen all of that, to lift the lid on the box again, is to accept that you might find nothing, that the DNA comes back and matches no one, that the work, the donations, the hope, all of it lands on another dead end. The volunteers knew that. They submitted it anyway. And then the part nobody talks about, the waiting. The DNA went out. The unit went back to whatever else was on the shelf, and somewhere in an outside lab, in a process the family did not see and could not hurry, Joni's case stopped being cold and started being something else. Not solved, not yet, but moving. For the first time in 28 years, the answer to who was no longer locked inside the evidence. It was out in the world. It just had not come back yet. Subscribe now, because the next part is how a stranger with no record anywhere finally got a name. And the name is exactly where this case stops making sense. They found him through his family. Forensic genetic genealogy does not start with a suspect. It starts with the DNA itself. Investigators take the unknown profile left at a crime scene and run it against the public genealogy databases, the same ones ordinary people upload to when they want to trace their ancestry. The search is not looking for the killer. The killer was never in the database. It is looking for his relatives, and relatives are enough. A partial match comes back. A second cousin, maybe. A great aunt, twice removed. None of them are the person who did this, but each one is a thread. Analysts pull those threads and begin building a family tree outward, branch by branch, generation by generation. Cousins, siblings, children. They cross-reference birth records, marriages, deaths. They rule out the lines that cannot fit, the people too young, too old, in the wrong place, the wrong sex. Slowly the tree fills in. Slowly the impossible names fall away. It is patient work. There is nothing dramatic about it. No single moment of revelation. No machine that spits out a name. Just a methodical narrowing, a tightening of the circle, until the field of possible people shrinks from a sprawling family to a small handful, then to a few, then to one. In this case, the tree pointed to a single man. His name was Roy C. Gomes. According to the Lane County Sheriff's Office, and as later reported by KVAL and NBC 16, detectives had never encountered that name, not in 31 years, not in the original files, not among the more than 40 men who had been questioned and cleared, not on any list, any tip, any margin note in any folder. Roy C. Gomes had no known relationship with Joni Grigsby. There was no evidence the two had ever met, no prior contact, no connection of any kind that anyone could find. He was, in the plainest language investigators could offer, a stranger. Lane County would describe what happened as a random act of violence, not a betrayal by someone she knew, not a grudge that had been waiting in the dark, just a man who crossed her path once and was never seen again, and was never connected to anyone who might have remembered him. For 3 decades, the question had always been some version of who would do this to her. The assumption underneath the assumption was that the answer would explain something, that when the name finally came, it would carry a reason with it, a history, a motive that could be traced back and understood. The name came. It explained nothing. But a name from a family tree is still only a lead. The genealogy pointed at Roy Gomes. It did not prove him. To close the distance between a strong probability and a certainty, investigators needed one more thing. They needed his actual DNA to compare against the profile that had waited all these years. And that is where the story turns stranger still. Subscribe and stay with this one, where investigators finally found Roy Gomes is colder than the genealogy that named him, and you will want to see it coming. Roy C. Gomes was 37 years old. That is most of what can be said about him with any certainty. He was on parole. He had no known link to Joni Grigsby, no tie to Springfield, no thread that anyone has been able to trace back to the night she died. He was, in the language detectives would later use, a stranger, not a suspect who had slipped the net, never once on anyone's list. A man who, by every account, had never crossed into the orbit of the case that would eventually carry his name. And he was not in Oregon when the answer came. He was hundreds of miles south of it, 2 states away, and he had been dead for years. On March 5, 2004, 9 years after Joni Grigsby was killed in Springfield, Sacramento police encountered Gomes in what became a violent confrontation. According to reporting by Lookout Eugene Springfield, drawn from the Sacramento records, officers began a foot chase. They deployed a taser. Gomes threw rocks. An officer reported seeing him make a motion consistent with throwing a knife. An officer fired, striking him in the chest. Roy Gomes died there, in a Sacramento street, far from the river town where a 33-year-old mother's case had gone cold. A subsequent review found no policy violations by the officers involved. In the ordinary course of an officer-involved death, an autopsy was performed, and as is standard in those cases, a DNA sample was collected. There was no reason in 2004 to connect that sample to anything. It was filed. It sat, a vial of a dead man's biology, archived in a city that had no idea a detective 2 states away would one day come looking for it. That detective did not yet exist on the case in 2004. The Lane County Cold Case Unit had not yet turned its genealogy work toward the evidence left at the 1995 scene. When it finally did, when that work, building a family tree out of fragments, produced a single name, the name was Roy C. Gomes, a man already 9 years in the ground, a man no one in Springfield had ever questioned, because no one in Springfield had ever heard of him. So the investigators did the only thing left to do. They went looking for him in the one place he still existed. The Lane County Sheriff's Office, the detectives following the genealogy, reached across the country to that 2004 autopsy and the sample it had preserved. They retrieved it, and they set it against the crime scene evidence kept from 1995, the material that had outlasted every dead end, every cleared man, every year. Hold the shape of it for a moment. 40 local men had been investigated and cleared. A careful net, cast wide, drawn tight, over nearly a decade. Neighbors, men who knew the town and the river, and the one name the net was built to catch, belonged to someone who had never lived in it. He left nothing in Springfield, no witness, no record, no reason. He left exactly one trace anywhere on Earth, and he did not leave it in Oregon. He left it on a coroner's table in Sacramento, in a sample the system happened to keep. Now 2 pieces of evidence, separated by 9 years and 2 states, one from a riverbank and one from an autopsy, lay side by side in a laboratory. The comparison was underway. The DNA collected at Roy Gomes's autopsy in 2004 matched the crime scene evidence from 1995. The Lane County Sheriff's Office confirmed it. After 31 years, the question of who attacked Joni Grigsby had an answer. It was a single line in a forensic report, a name attached at last to a profile that had sat unmatched for 3 decades. What that means is worth stating plainly. 6 retired volunteers working on donated money out of a unit the public helped fund had done what 31 years of official investigation could not. No federal task force closed this. No new detective with a fresh budget. A small volunteer donor-funded cold case unit followed the evidence to a comparison nobody else had thought to run, and the comparison held. The science had finally caught up to the crime, and then the hollow at the center of it. There would be no prosecution. There would be no trial, because Roy Gomes was already dead. He died on March 5, 2004, more than 2 decades before the match was made. No court can try a dead man. No jury would be seated. No prosecutor would stand and read the charges. There would be no verdict, no sentencing, no moment when Joni's family could sit in a courtroom and watch the person responsible answer for what he did. The answer arrived too late to ever become justice. The family was notified on March 12, 2026. The public announcement came on June 11, 2026. And here is where the whole undercurrent of this case finally surfaces. Consider everything that had to align for the answer to come at all. 31 years of waiting, 2 decades of genealogy science slowly maturing into a tool that could do this work. A biological sample, preserved and kept. An autopsy performed in 2004 on a man who died 2 states away, the file sitting in a record system until someone thought to pull it. Every one of those threads had to hold for the truth to be reached. And when it was reached, when the match was confirmed and the name was finally known, the official word for why Joni Grigsby was attacked was this: random. According to investigators, Roy Gomes had no known connection to Joni Grigsby. None. They had never met. There was no relationship to trace, no grievance to uncover, no history between them that anyone could find. The Lane County Sheriff's Office described the attack as random, a stranger, a crossing of paths that should never have happened, with no reason behind it that the evidence could explain. That is the shape of the answer. No motive, no relationship, no reason. For 31 years, the case had held one kind of certainty: how it happened. What it could never offer was why. And now the why had been chased to its very end, through science and patience and a comparison that finally landed. And at the end of that long road, the system reached the truth, and the truth was empty. There was nothing there to find. The case was solved. After 3 decades, it was genuinely, forensically solved. And the answer it gave back was that there is no answer. Subscribe before the last chapter, because what 31 years of waiting actually got this family is the hardest part of the whole story. They have his name now. After 31 years, the file finally carries an answer. But look at what that answer actually is. On March 12, 2026, Joni Grigsby's brother got the call. 19 years sober, John Roberts spends his days now helping other people climb out of the same hole he climbed out of. He had waited 3 decades for a knock, a name, a reason. The name came, and it was a name he had never heard in his life. A man with no connection anyone has been able to trace. No motive anyone can name. Speaking to KVAL, John Roberts put it the way the whole family had always put it. There's always just been questions like, where did this guy come from? Hear that carefully. That question is still open. Not because the work failed, because the only person who could answer it is gone, and he took the answer with him. Then there is the part that should not have happened the way it did. John Shores is Joni's son. He carried her absence longer than anyone, since he was a boy. And when the case finally broke, he did not get a phone call from an investigator. He found out the way you might be finding out right now, from the news. NBC 16 and Lookout Eugene Springfield reported what the family lived. The people who had held this grief for 31 years were, at the very end, still standing somewhat outside the system that was supposed to be working for them. The match cleared, the press moved, and her son read about it like a stranger. So name plainly what this solved case is and what it is not. It is a name attached at last to what was done to her. It is a DNA match that held under every test. It is a win for a small unit of volunteers who refused to let her file go cold. It is science doing exactly what science promised. That is real, and it matters. But it is not a trial. Roy C. Gomes was never charged, never questioned, never made to sit across a table and account for a single thing. He died in a Sacramento shootout in 2004, years before anyone knew to look for him, never once connected to her case. There is no verdict. There is no sentence. There is no day in court where the why gets spoken aloud. And it is not Joni back. She was, by every account of the people who loved her, full of warmth and life. A mother, a sister. She is still gone. That does not change because a name got typed into a file. So here is what remains. And it is a real question, not a comfortable one. We know who. We will never know why. The man who could have told us has been dead for more than 20 years, and no one ever got to ask him. A stranger crossed Joni Grigsby's path for reasons that died with him in 2004. The match arrived. The why never will. And somewhere in that gap sits a family that solved the unsolvable, and still, after all of it, is waiting on a knock at the door that came late, came second-hand, and never quite arrived the way it should have. And if you made it all the way here and still won't subscribe, I want to know why. Tell me in the comments. While you're there, tell me this too. What do you do with a case that's finally solved, when the only person who could explain it died before anyone ever got to ask?